What are bias response teams and how to fight back against secretive woke educators? We'll discuss all this and more on this special sponsored edition of The Editors, brought to you by our good friends at the Goldwater Institute. I'm Rich Lowry, and I'm joined this episode by Christian Schneider, an old friend who used to write for NRO and is a former reporter at the College Fix, and Jon Riches, Vice President of Litigation at Goldwater. So, Christian, let's start with you. What is a bias response team? A lot of our listeners might not know what a bias response team is. I'm not sure that I know a great deal what a bias response team is, but it sounds like a sinister combination of something that is Orwellian and Maoist at the same time.
You are correct on all counts. So you remember probably back in the late 80s where schools had speech codes. Donna Shalala was big on this at the UW-Madison, where they had lists of things that you could not say. So those speech codes that were all the rage were rocketed out of existence by courts all over America. So we get to around 2015 or so, the internet is up and running, and schools decide, well, maybe we can take these speech codes and kind of modernize them and outsource them to students. So maybe this will pass constitutional muster, since it's students essentially reporting each other. So they set up these systems.
What could go wrong?
Yeah. So they set up these systems where students could anonymously report each other for alleged incidents of bias. So you go to a website, you type in your complaint, you heard somebody in a private conversation say something that made you uncomfortable, or you're in a classroom and a professor, mentions something about sexual assault without giving you a trigger warning first. These types of things, you can report other students or professors to the administration, to the bias response team, at which point the team will reach out to the offending student, or they can take a letter and put it in a professor's file, something to that effect. So they've essentially taken college campuses and turned them into surveillance states where students are encouraged to kind of narc on each other. And these are even worse than the speech codes in some respect, because in the speech codes, you actually had a list of things that you couldn't say. Whereas now the standard for things that you can't say or that offend people are solely up to the person that hears it. So you have no idea whether something you're saying is offensive or not. The example that we just got from the University of Arizona through our work with the Goldwater Institute was there a bunch of students playing this Pictionary-like game that online, and somebody has the word cotton that they have to draw a picture, and the other students have to guess what it is. And so she begins drawing a picture of a person picking cotton.
Oh, no.
That upset all the other students in the not all, but a student, to the point where they reported the other student to the bias response team, to the diversity counselors at the school, because they say it represented an African American slave picking cotton, and that student was written up. The most famous example we had was at Michigan State University, where a student is in his room and he's watching an online video of Ben Shapiro, and we all know who Ben Shapiro is, the conservative commentator. And his roommate looks over at him and immediately reports him to the bias response team, because his roommate in the dorm, in the privacy of their own dorm, he says he was watching hate speech in the room, and he requested a new roommate, and the school complied with that. So these are the types of things that happens with professors all the time. Students getting back at professors for giving them bad grades, saying that they said something untoward in class, and there really is no appeals process or anything. Once you're reported. So we thought that was a big enough thing where these records were open records for public schools. So through my job at the College Fix, I would go in, I would request these records from the universities and say specifically that, we don't want to shame any students or anything. So you can redact the names of the students if possible. We want to be able to keep their privacy. And, 32 schools I've written up and done extensive reporting on these types of things. But every now and then you'll find a school that says, well, no, these are private records. We can't give them out to you. But we think that this is very important for parents and for students to know what schools have these, what people are reporting each other for at these schools. And, it's a matter of public importance. And so we've been doing that reporting, and through the help of the Goldwater Institute, we've been able to get the records from the University of Arizona, which we just put up last week.
That's fantastic. So I want to dig in on the transparency issue a little bit more in a minute. But so how does it typically work? So I've done something, that's offended someone, and I've gotten reported. When do I learn that I've been reported?
Typically, you would hear from a diversity counselor through email or through the bias response team, BRT. Somebody within the team, and then they can request, to have a meeting with you, a sit down. They can make you apologize. They can do all of these things. A lot of the schools, they say, well, this isn't infringing on students' First Amendment rights, when it obviously is. But they say it's not, because the process is really the punishment. They say, well, there's no punishment for these students. They're not being expelled or anything, but they are, shamed through going through this process, which can, it can be tough on them. So they're being shamed essentially by the school for saying something that would normally be protected under the First Amendment.
And do you, is there often sort of trainings involved to try to make sure when you play that Pictionary type game in the future, that some other depiction of cotton would be less offensive, or does it just depends differ from school to school?
It depends on school to school, but yeah, there can be schools that will request that you go into training if you do something like that. Some schools on their, they have the bias response team and they have a governing board. And in places like the University of Illinois and other schools, there's actually a law enforcement officer on, a member of the school police on the bias response team. So it is literally a speech police in those cases. So that can be intimidating, and it keeps students from speaking out. They're now self-censoring, knowing that even if they're in their own dorm room watching a video, that they can be written up.
Yeah, there's the horrifying survey. I think the Cato Institute has done a couple of them, asking how free people feel to express their views. And it's just like super majorities, we're scared, and we self-censor, in what's supposed to be the freest country on earth. So Jon, let's just go a little broader. So hiding the ball on these bias response teams, which colleges do, is part of the picture. But you've also had these just shocking, horrifying stories in public schools hiding curricula, schools hiding various what various personnel are doing, or what they're doing with so-called equity audits. And this has been a major focus of the Goldwater Institute to push back and seek transparency in these kind of cases.
Right. Yeah, we've been looking at government transparency, academic transparency, both K-12 and higher ed. And we've seen some truly disturbing examples. But I think one thing that's important for the listeners to understand, kind of right at the outset, every state has its own state public records law. So a lot of people are familiar with the federal Freedom of Information Act, or the FOIA, that says government operations are open to public review unless some exemption applies. Well, each state has its own version of that law. And in many cases, most cases, those state laws are a lot broader than the federal FOIA. The exemptions are narrower. The definition of public information is broader. And so, whether it's parents trying to figure out what their kids are going to learn, or whether it's reporters or members of the public trying to figure out what's going on university campuses, these laws can be really powerful tools to open up public operations. So I know Christian has used these throughout the country, looking at these bias response teams, and oftentimes universities will comply, sometimes they won't. We've represented parents and others looking at K-12 issues. So, one thing that's kind of interesting that overlaps with this bias response team at the K-12 level, we're seeing a lot of school districts farm out what should be done in public, under public review, so in an open meetings, or what should be subject to the public records law. They're farming them out to quote unquote private advisory committees. So sometimes they call these things like diversity, equity, inclusion advisory committees. And then they'll staff them with members of the public. Sometimes there's, more often than not, there's lawmakers or elected officials on there, administrators, et cetera. And they'll do all these sorts of things like come up with new policies or recommend certain actions regarding hiring or firing. And this quote unquote private group will do all of this public work shielded from public review, and then bring it to the school district or the public body, which will simply rubber stamp it. And so I view these bias response teams as sort of kind of part of this, where you have these quasi entities that are trying to shield what obviously should be open to the public from public review. And so we've done a lot of work just trying to ensure that there's academic transparency across the board with these things, K-12 and higher ed.
So a question about transparency laws. This is kind of neither here nor there, but I'm kind of curious whether this impression of mine is correct. I have the sense that when these laws were established, I don't know, began to be a major focus in the 80s, whatever it was, that it was overwhelmingly kind of Ralph Nader leftist reformers who are pushing for them. And it just seems to me now that conservatives and libertarians are using them much more, even more. I mean, both sides can use them, obviously, but it seems like they're more of a focus than they used to be. Is that true, or am I mistaken there?
That seems right to me too, anecdotally. It's almost as if, like, the left has abandoned commitment to free speech, by and large, and conservatives and libertarians have taken that up. I think you're right with a lot of these open government sort of laws. It's conservatives, libertarians, the conservative media that are using these laws now more than, broadly speaking, the left. And oftentimes you'll have leftist folks trying to hide the public's business from the public by doing these things to try and get around the laws.
So let's dig into a few specific cases. So Christian, you mentioned the University of Arizona. So what walks through a little bit what happened with that one?
Well, yeah. So we actually, back in 2019, I think I did my first request of the University of Arizona. So Christian, by the way, this is just, you're a reporter, you get interested in bias response teams, and you're like, I'm digging in. That's how you came to have this as such a focus? Yeah, exactly. I mean, just as a reporter and as a conservative / libertarian, I was outraged by the fact that the schools are setting up these systems, essentially encouraging students to inform on one another. So I wanted to see what was going on. So the first batch of open records requests that I did was for the University of Arizona back in 2019. And they got back to me with exactly what I asked for. And there wasn't really anything all that exciting in there, so I didn't write about it at the time. But then last year, I was set to do another round of and hit some of the same schools that I had before. University of Arizona was among them, and I send them the request just like I did the last time, and I get a letter back from them saying, well, these records are private, and they're not disclosable under state law. And I said to myself, now wait a minute, these were you disclosed them to me just 2 years ago, so clearly they are releasable under state law. They are subject to the state sunshine law. And Arizona State, I did a request of them as well, and they've got some good examples too, and they sent me theirs as well. So Arizona State didn't think there was anything in state law preventing these records from being released, and they didn't think that privacy was a big concern with regards to these records. So I immediately reached out to the Goldwater Institute, as they are in Arizona, and I thought, well, maybe they'll know.
Way to connect the dots, Christian.
It's why I'm a reporter. I just hoping, maybe they knew somebody in the university, or maybe they've done a similar type of records request. And I asked them, so what's going on here? These are open records, right? And they got back to me right away and they said, this is perfect. This is, we're starting this effort to try to get more transparency in universities and K through 12 schools and places all over America, and this would be a good example. So they sent the University of Arizona a letter on my behalf, on the College Fix's behalf, and said, "Hey, what are you guys doing here? These are open records, clearly, providing them with the evidence." And without much fuss, Arizona sent me back the records within a couple of weeks. So it was effective. The Goldwater Institute got me the results I was looking for. So I was
way to go, Jon.
Yeah.
Way to go.
Thank you.
How bad was the case, by the way, Christian? What the bias response teams were up to there?
They were pretty bad. There was another professor who a student reported him for using outdated words like, quote, transgendered, and I believe he used the word transsexual. And this is a professor who was trying to use an example in class and try to be inclusive by bringing in transgender people or an example, and yet he gets popped by a student for taking that extra step because he used, quote unquote, outdated terms. So that was another example. All the examples are up at the College Fix. You can see them there, but those are the types of things we see.
Yeah, we've talked about on this podcast before whether it was a hypothetical. I forget what the occasion was for it, but I asked the panelists, if you could be hired by Harvard University for a teaching fellowship, would you take it? And it was like, no, we would get instantly fired. We'd have to live in fear the whole time. I mean, the really scary thing is just inadvertently. And it's one thing if you're, being offensive as a troll or to make a point, but a lot of these cases are just people, two you've mentioned, just people making innocent mistakes.
There was an example at University of Wisconsin-Madison where a professor is standing in front of the class and he's talking about, there are some theories that you can talk about now and you can't. And he said, some people think that their theories are sacred cows that can't be touched or whatever. And of course, he gets reported by a student for using the term sacred cows, because some people do believe cows are sacred and is offensive to them. So one of my favorite examples is actually from Arizona State, where there are these two students in an acting class, a male student and a female student, and evidently they had spent a couple of weeks practicing this scene for their final exam for this class. And it's an emotional scene where there's some yelling and things like that, but they practice it for a couple of weeks. They finally get to the final exam, and the male student evidently really goes for it, in the scene. He's yelling, it's really emotional. And the professor sees that and she reports the male student for overacting, saying that he was going for it, and it just made them the female student uncomfortable, and that she was duty bound to report it. And this is the most ridiculous. The female student didn't report it, even if she was uncomfortable. It was actually the professor that took it upon herself to report it on behalf of the student. And it just shows how ridiculous this is all getting.
Yeah, I mean, the course of American popular culture might have been different. People could have been reported for and cracked down for their overacting of
Al Pacino would be in prison.
Yeah, exactly.
Marlon Brando yelling Stella.
So, John, how often is it the case that an institution gets a letter from you, and that's enough to do it?
About I'd probably 50-50, a little less than 50-50. I mean, the thing about these are these laws are generally very favorable to the public. So there's a presumption in favor of transparency. Secrecy is the exception. If there's exemptions, so like, for example, student privacy, or any person's privacy, if that's included in a public record, that can be redacted. What was kind of interesting about Christian's case, sidebar, is when he first requested the records, the university came back and said, "Oh no, that there's privacy information in there," even though Christian's request said, "Please don't give me any private student information," and redact it if there's any in there. But if a public entity claims that these exemptions apply, they have the burden of proving that they do when and if this goes to court. So kind of a long way of saying that once you get to court, these things are very much, the public records laws are very much in favor of the public and in favor of open government. But sometimes universities or other, K-12, other public entities will bank on the fact that the person requesting the records won't ever take them to court. And, maybe that was the case here, where the U of A previously disclosed these records 2 years ago to Christian, and then decided not to. And it wasn't until they got a letter from a lawyer that they changed their tune. But, that's pretty absurd in and of itself. I mean, it shouldn't require lawyers to get this information. This should just be turned over. So, once they do get a letter, I think they start kind of having more of a come to God moment. But sometimes they are obstinate, and it requires litigation.
And this is an important point. Let me mention this too. In some of the requests that I've made, if you're just a regular citizen and not necessarily a reporter, and you send a request and the school just says, "Nope," well, you're just kind of stuck there. I mean, what are you going to do? Unless you have thousands of dollars to spend on an attorney to, send them a letter, to take them to court, to see this all the way through, if they say no, then the answer is no. We found this with the University of California system. I mean, you can just imagine what the bias response team at a place like Berkeley or UCLA or somewhere,
probably armed.
And the California system, public system, is just an iron fortress. They won't give you anything. And we just looked at it after they turned us down, and we said, "Do we have $10,000 to see this all the way through?" And we don't, which is why the work the Goldwater Institute did for us was great. They helped us out a great deal on that.
So, John, let's hit a few other greatest hits of your guys' work. We did a podcast with this mom in Rhode Island last year, Nicole Solis, and I actually integrated her story and talks I give around the country. It's just so shocking. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the thumb scale is, her daughter's going to kindergarten in the public school. She's like, you guys don't teach critical theory or anything like that. And then what the principal says makes her really nervous. She digs in some more. The schools get resistant. It's basically, make a FOIA request. She does. And then the school district's like, "Oh my gosh, we've incurred so much expense complying with your request. You owe us, $74,000. Oh, and by the way, the teachers lobby is going to, teachers union is going to sue you." Where does that case stand?
Yeah, I mean, truly extraordinary set of facts. All Nicole did was ask, "Hey, what's my kindergartner going to learn?" And then rather than answer that question, it was actually the school district that sort of channeled her into the formal public records process. And like you said, when they thought she had submitted too many because she started to learn more things that were troubling that the district was doing, the district threatened to sue her, and I think they decided that wouldn't be a good idea. But then the NEA, the National Education Association's state chapter, the union, then did sue her for requesting public records. So we're still in litigation on that. Basically, now the union has said, okay, we'll just go ahead and dismiss this But in the meantime, of course, Nicole has incurred, substantial difficulty, had to hire lawyers, and Rhode Island has what's called an anti-SLAPP statute. That's a strategic lawsuit against public participation, which says you can't sue people for exercising their rights, which is exactly what the union did here. So we're still litigating that question, and we're hoping to get fees and possibly damages because the union brought a case against a public records requester for simply asking for public records, which is both outrageous and we think unlawful in Rhode Island.
Yeah, just completely shocking that I hope you guys prevail on that one, obviously, but just even if you do, to be dragged through all that drama and have this become a big element of your life when all you wanted to know is what's going to be taught your kindergartner, which you have an inherent right to know. You've also have a case in Rye, New York, involving what money was being spent on a so-called equity audit.
Yeah, so this school district out in New York was doing what a lot of these districts are doing, and what I had referred to earlier, where they'll go to some private entity, in this case, the NYU Steinhardt School, and they'll say, come and audit us to make sure that, we're sufficiently woke. And oh, by the way, they'll often spend tens of thousands of dollars in taxpayer monies on this audit. So then the private entity will come in, it'll conduct an audit, and they'll say, nope, you really aren't sufficiently woke. Hire us again, and then we'll give you some recommendations on how you might become appropriately woke. And then they'll spend much more money on, with this private entity to get this instruction or these recommendations from them. And so this sort of thing was going on in Rye. It's going on throughout the country. And so we had requested some public records saying, hey, look, how did this contract come into place? Did you bid this out? Or was the fix in where you always intended to go with this one private vendor? And oh, by the way, when you set up these committees and these meetings, tell us about them. Give us your emails, give us your records of these things. And so they responded, and they gave us very, very few records. And in some of the records they gave us, it was really clear that other stuff existed. So like those records would reference, based on my email from last week, but then the email from last week wasn't produced. So it was really clear that they were hiding a lot of this stuff. So using some of our pro bono attorneys in our American Freedom Network, we've got a big pro bono network throughout the country. We've brought a case now against Rye to compel the production of this info that they're clearly hiding.
And then there's one in Fairfax, Virginia, that you guys, my understanding, you won on behalf of these moms who sued their school district for posting public information. Sorry, they're being sued by their school district. I mean, this is a bizarre thing. The people seeking information are being sued, but they were sued for posting public information about the district's spending on their website.
Yeah, this was a wild circumstance. So there was a couple moms out in Fairfax, and one of them operated a website where she would post public information that she received from the district. And she was particularly concerned, as rightfully concerned, with the amount of money that the school district was spending on private lawyers. When you get some of these records, by the way, these public entities spending money on private attorneys it can be truly outrageous. But so she was concerned about that. She requested some records. She got the records and she posted them on her website. And then the school district came back and said, oops, we gave you some information in there that we shouldn't have. Take everything down. And they went to court and sued the mother for an injunction to take down the public information that they had provided her. And that's of course a prior restraint on speech. It's clearly unconstitutional. So we represented the moms and got that injunction dissolved and got the case dismissed. But I think all this sort of highlights why it's important to kind of have projects like we've set up. Obviously not everybody can afford a lawyer. People don't know what to do in these sort of outrageous cases where the public's going after them for requesting public information, which is why we set up our open government project, what we call openmygovernment.org, so that we can both help the public submit these things, submit the right type of request with the right information in it. And then if they run into headwinds, we can provide legal assistance either here in-house or connect them with one of our pro bono attorneys throughout the country. And we're hopeful that this project encourages many more parents, many more members of the public, many more reporters to utilize these laws to get public information that they're entitled to.
Yeah, so it's openmygovernment.org. And I would just emphasize, I think this was a theme in the podcast with Nicole as well. Trust no one. Trust no one. If you have the slightest suspicion, go find out and request the records. So, Jon, you obviously have this resource to help people. How difficult is it to file a FOIA?
Very simple. Very simple in most cases. So, usually you just send an email, you send a letter, or sometimes public entities have online submission portals. You include, the basic information that you're seeking. If you know what the record is, describe it, particularly. But we also have put up at that website that you mentioned, openmygovernment.org, we have a FOIA template there. And then we have an explainer guide that says, okay, here's the person you address it to, and here's what that means in this explainer guide. And then we have a pretty brief 50-state survey that sort of covers every state's open records law. So that anybody can just go there and say, okay, I'm sitting in Arizona, I'm sitting in Texas, here's how it works in that state, here's a template, and they can go from there.
So, Christian, obviously these kind of requests have been indispensable to your work.
Yes, absolutely. And they are easy to find. You just type in the name of the school you want, and then FOIA, and it'll take you right to the school's public records officer. Or sometimes some schools make it a little more difficult. Arizona, for instance, they make you print out a physical copy, fill it in, and then scan it and send it back. But for the most part, they're really easy. They have these online portals where you can just request what you're looking for. We have run into some cases where they charge you for the records, sometimes exorbitantly, and that's been a problem too. But for the most part, I'm actually surprised at how easy it is.
So, Christian, you've been around the block a few times. As I mentioned in the introduction, you have written for National Review. You're an old friend of ours, so you pay a lot of attention to conservative journalism and have been a practitioner for a long time. It seems to me, that we have a podcast or two just about conservative journalism. But one thing that has been going on, this is a change, is there is this repertorial activity and ferment much more than there was before. I mean, 20 years ago, I think by and large, there were some exceptions, but most of conservative journalism was just opinion. I shouldn't say just, because it's a huge element of what National Review does. But now, College Fix, Washington Free Beacon, other places, they're people determined not just to comment on the news, but to make news, to hold people to account, to uncover scandals.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, a few years ago when we were all getting started, it was, if you have a hot take and you want to write a column, you can do that. And a lot of them are great to read. But now, in an era where anybody can publish anything, in the era of Substack or whatever, everybody's got opinions about everything. And the thing that's of real value is providing people new information. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the most valuable thing that you can do. And I think it's what people are looking for. So by going and finding these records and digging into what your local government is doing, as long as you're providing people new information, that's really where it is right now. And I think conservatives have gotten on the train, and they're doing a heck of a lot better at it. With there are a number of new outlets that are doing really great reporting. So the idea is, hopefully someday it's not just the conservative outlets that are doing this type of reporting, where you actually get some conservatives in some legacy newsrooms that are doing this type of reporting. But for now, we're doing the best we can.
So, and Jon, that's obviously the Goldwater approach. You're pro-information. You might, I assume, you're kind of opposed to these underlying initiatives, but the first order of business, as far as you're concerned and legally, is just getting the information. And as a cliche goes, sunshine is the best disinfectant.
Yep. And the public has a right to know what our government's up to. All these laws exist to achieve that. The way we hold our government accountable is first and foremost by knowing what they're doing. And so, these laws are very, very beneficial in that regard, and we want to do everything we can to enforce them. And then, hopefully, more and more to get to the point where enforcement's not necessary, where public entities do the right thing and either proactively provide this information, or provide it without much resistance when it's requested.
So, Christian, also, I don't want to drag you into a conversation about the state of the right generally, but it occurs to me this is one area, and there are more, and I think it'd be better if everyone focused on them, where there's a huge overlap between the priorities of the so-called new right, which doesn't like CRT, doesn't like woke education, none of us do, and the more libertarian-oriented people who want to hold government to account, who don't like government trampling free speech, who don't like government propagandizing. So, you can look at your work, and someone from the new right would be delighted with it, and a libertarian would be delighted with it too, or should be. Yeah, I mean, there does seem to be I wouldn't say a conflict, but there is a disagreement in the right, and it's a healthy disagreement in terms of what the power of government is to do. You would take somebody that is more libertarian, and they would say, okay, well, we need sunshine, we need to know what these people are doing, and we need to take cultural action in order to stop CRT, or if schools are wasting their time on DEI and any of this stuff, then let's do that. But then you have kind of the the post-liberal right, who are saying, well, in the places where we actually have control of government, we need to start using government to shift the narrative. We need to do the kind of the DeSantis plan, and have a more muscular government, and that government can be good in changing the culture as long as we're in charge of it. I'm a little wary of that approach, but it's the debate that's going on right now. But in either case, having good information is important, and people should be willing to go to their government and figure out just exactly what's going on. So, Jon, bring us home here. Tell us a little bit more about the Goldwater Institute, when it began, how long it's been going, and how people can get hooked up, because people need to be involved. This is not a time for sitting on the sidelines.
I appreciate that. Yeah. So we've been around since 1988. We were set up with the blessing of Senator Goldwater. And for many years, we operated as a traditional state-based think tank, research, legislative proposals. In 2007, a guy named Clint Bolick came on board, now Justice Bolick on the Arizona Supreme Court, and he stood up our public interest litigation component. And when he did that, we had within our organization, for the first time in the country, for a state-based organization, sort of all of these elements: a research and analysis, a legislative component, and then a public interest litigation component, so that when there was government overreach in areas, in the areas that we address, our free market reforms, property rights, regulatory reform, things like that. Not only could we recommend policy proposals, but we could enforce constitutional rights in court. And I think this project, this open government project, fits really neatly within that model. These laws exist out there to protect the public, to allow all of us to receive information from our government. They can be improved in some cases legislatively, and they can certainly be enforced in the courts. And so we're hopeful that we're able to provide assistance to people that are looking to learn what their government is up to, and if they have any problems, then they can reach out to us and check out our website, openmygovernment.org, where our resources are, and I think hopefully it'll help just a little bit, provide some more info as to what our state and local governments are doing.
And again, it's openmygovernment.org. Everyone, please check it out. So that's it for this special sponsored edition of The Editors. Our regularly scheduled programming will return soon. You have been listening to a National Review podcast. Any rebroadcast, retransmission, or account of this game without the express written permission of National Review Magazine is strictly prohibited. This podcast has been produced by the incomparable Sarah Schutte, who makes it sound better than we deserve. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Jon. And thanks especially to all of you for listening. We're The Editors. We'll see you next time.